In the shadowy forests of upstate New York, a chilling discovery was made in 1862. Beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned church, authorities uncovered 143 unmarked graves. Each skeleton bore signs of deliberate, methodical torture, healed fractures, deep bone carvings, and evidence of repeated near drownings. This forgotten church had a name: the Church of the Pure Spirit. And for over 160 years, every federal record tied to it was sealed, classified, untouchable. I've gained access to documents never seen by the public, revealing the horrific truth behind one of the most disturbing religious cults in American history. It all began with three brothers: Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. Charismatic, cunning, and utterly devout, they preached a twisted gospel. Only through suffering could the soul be purified. Hundreds followed them, believing pain was the path to salvation. And in the town they founded, Ravenwood, they built their isolated sanctuary. Ravenwood was an ordinary frontier village, established in 1803 about 40 miles north of Albany. Just 300 settlers lived quietly among the trees, farming the land and trading with nearby towns. But this peaceful community sat at the heart of a spiritual wildfire. The Second Great Awakening was sweeping across America, a time of religious fervor, revival, and revelation. And in that chaos, the Ravencroft brothers planted the seeds of something far darker. A movement that would bury its victims in silence. Until now. This region of New York would soon earn a chilling nickname: the Burned-Over District. Religious fire swept through the land, igniting town after town with revivalist passion. Old beliefs were questioned, new sects exploded into being, and charismatic preachers could summon thousands to open-air sermons that shook the earth with hallelujahs. It was into this spiritual wildfire that the Ravencroft brothers arrived, during the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, aged 42, led the trio. Commanding and stoic, his nearly black eyes seemed to stare straight through flesh and bone when he spoke of divine matters. Deacon Silas, 39, looked more the scholar than the preacher, wire-rimmed spectacles, fingers stained with ink from endless scripture writing, and a quiet intellect that balanced his elder brother's intensity. But it was the youngest, Prophet Caleb, just 35, who left the deepest impression. He possessed a disturbing magnetism, his voice no louder than a whisper, yet somehow it carried across even the noisiest rooms. His pale blue eyes, they said, would roll back during visions, as if he were staring straight into another world. The brothers came prepared, wealthy, organized, and purposeful. They purchased a vast tract of land on the outskirts of Ravenwood and began building what they called the Church of the Pure Spirit. But this was no ordinary church. It wasn't painted white like the classic New England meeting houses. It was built from dark stone, quarried from the nearby hills. Its design was eerie, an octagonal sanctuary, surrounded by 8 smaller chambers. A towering steeple pierced the forest canopy, far grander than anything the locals had ever seen. And perhaps most unsettling, the sanctuary had no windows. During services, light came only from carefully arranged lanterns, casting flickering shadows along the stone walls. At their first public gathering, drawn more by curiosity than conviction, the church was full. Elder Ezra stood before them and proclaimed, "We have been called by the Spirit to this place. In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message, purification through tribulation. The Spirit has shown us that Ravenwood's destiny had been rewritten. The brothers' arrival wasn't an accident. It was perfectly timed." By 1825, the religious landscape of America was in chaos. Traditional denominations, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, were rapidly losing their grip. In their place rose emotional, demonstrative movements, sweeping across the frontier like a storm. Methodists roamed the back roads, their circuit riders preaching fire and repentance in muddy fields. Baptists multiplied, appealing to individual experiences of salvation. And new American-born faiths were just beginning to rise. In fact, less than 100 miles away, and just a few years later, Joseph Smith would publish the Book of Mormon, birthing a new movement that would shake the country. It was in this whirlwind of belief, doubt, and desperate spiritual hunger that the Ravencroft brothers' message took root. At first, their doctrine seemed deceptively simple. True salvation, they preached, could only be achieved through suffering. Suffering that burned away sin like fire purifies metal. Suffering that mirrored Christ's agony on the cross. But what set them apart, what made their message truly terrifying, was how literal they were. Pain wasn't symbolic. It was sacred. Necessary. During those early sermons, Deacon Silas would explain calmly, almost academically. The flesh is the vessel of sin, he said. Therefore, the flesh must be tested, tried, and purified through tribulation. Only when the body has been broken, can the spirit truly soar. And so began the doctrine of purification through torment. Their following grew steadily in that first year. But joining was not easy. Each potential convert was subjected to a discernment interview, alone, in a candlelit room, across from Prophet Caleb. No one knows exactly what he asked them. Only that many came out weeping, and a few never returned at all. Those accepted fell into three hauntingly familiar categories. The desperately poor, seeking purpose and shelter, the spiritually wounded, trying to escape past sins, and the wealthy elite, craving religious ecstasy they couldn't find in stone cathedrals. Among the first to join was Margaret Wilkins. A grieving widow, she had buried her husband and 2 children the previous winter, victims of scarlet fever. She wandered through Ravenwood in a fog of despair, on the edge of ending her own life. Until she met Elder Ezra. He took her hand, looked into her eyes, and whispered, "The Spirit has chosen you." That moment would change everything. He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts. So wrote Margaret Wilkins in a private journal, later recovered by federal investigators. He told me my suffering had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair. By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown to nearly 100 followers. Some built crude wooden homes around the dark stone sanctuary. Others remained in Ravenwood but spent most of their waking hours on the church grounds. The Ravencroft brothers urged their flock to give up everything. Land, money, possessions, worldly attachments, they said, are chains that bind the spirit to earth. To ascend, one must let go. The most devoted followers were offered a sacred title, vessels of the Spirit. But this honor came at a cost. They were required to undergo deeper purification, a set of rituals more intense than anything the congregation had yet witnessed. At first, these ceremonies seemed merely harsh. Days of fasting, night-long prayer vigils, repeated submersions in icy water meant to drown the sinful self. To outsiders, it still looked like eccentric devotion. But behind the closed stone walls of the church, something darker was unfolding. The Ravencrofts were escalating, deliberately, methodically. Like the fable of the frog in a pot of slowly boiling water. Their followers didn't notice the shift from discomfort to danger. By 1829, the transformation was nearly complete. Construction began on an underground network of chambers, beneath the church, beneath the earth. No one outside the inner circle knew their true purpose. But by then, it didn't matter. The brothers had seized total control of their followers' minds, their bodies, and their very sense of reality. And so, as winter descended, the final veil began to fall. On December 21, 1829, the longest night of the year, the Church of the Pure Spirit crossed a threshold from religious oddity into something far more sinister. In a private conversation recorded years later, Prophet Caleb whispered to his brothers. The sheep have been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd. But what the people of Ravenwood didn't yet understand was that in the Ravencroft gospel, the shepherd did not protect his flock. He offered them the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. What happened that night inside the Church of the Pure Spirit would later be referred to, only in hidden, internal documents, as the First Ascension. It was the beginning of something far darker. A blueprint for the horror that would follow. The day began with an urgent proclamation from Elder Ezra. Prophet Caleb had received a divine vision in the night. The entire congregation, nearly 150 followers, was summoned to the sanctuary. As darkness fell and the temperature plunged below freezing, the followers gathered in the windowless stone church, lit only by 12 massive candles arranged in a precise spiral pattern carved into the wooden floor. The spiral led to a central platform, raised slightly like an altar. The air inside was heavy with smoke, frost, and anticipation. One man who witnessed it all, Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith and recent convert, would later escape the cult and give federal investigators a detailed account of what took place. According to Hartford, Elder Ezra stood before the crowd, eyes blazing with fervor. "Brothers and sisters," he shouted, "we have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently toward understanding. But the Spirit grows impatient with our progress. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation. And it demands more, far more, than we have ever asked." Then, from the shadows of a side chamber, Prophet Caleb appeared. Witnesses described his appearance as almost inhuman. His skin was chalk-white, his movements erratic and twitching. His eyes rolled back, revealing only the whites. And then, he spoke. Not in English, but in a language he claimed was angelic, a terrifying mix of guttural growls, clicking consonants, and high-pitched wails that reverberated off the stone walls. The sound was so unnatural, several followers reportedly fainted. Others dropped to their knees in relevant silence. After several agonizing minutes, Caleb collapsed. And when he roused, he spoke in his normal voice. But something was different. His tone, his rhythm, it was hypnotic. "The Spirit has chosen 3 among you," he said, "for the honor of First Ascension." He called them by name. Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. All 3 were new converts, hand-picked, unaware of what awaited them. Led by Deacon Silas, the chosen were brought to the center of the spiral. Stripped to their undergarments, shivering in the bitter cold. And then, the ritual began. It was a ceremony unlike anything I believed possible among civilized people, Thomas Hartford later testified. What happened next would never be fully understood. Because no official records exist. Only fractured survivor testimonies, cryptic journal entries, and the physical evidence uncovered decades later beneath the church floor. And from that night forward, the Ravencroft doctrine would never be the same. The era of symbolic suffering had ended. Now came the age of blood. They were brought, one by one, to the center of the sanctuary. And there, under the flickering candlelight, bound to wooden frames, inverted crosses, handcrafted with almost ceremonial care, Elder Ezra stood before the congregation and addressed the symbolism. "This is not blasphemy," he said. "The inverted cross marks the path from pride to humility, from comfort to suffering, from life to death, to rebirth." And so began what the Ravencroft brothers called the 7 trials of purification. The room, silent but for the sound of breathing and cracking wood, became a theater of holy torment. Small blue diamond emoji, the first trial, air. Wet cloths were draped over each victim's face. Water poured slowly, steadily, creating the sensation of drowning. Small blue diamond emoji, the second trial, earth. Soil from the church grounds, considered sacred, was packed tightly around their bodies. buried up to their necks. They were left gasping in cold darkness. Underscore. Small blue diamond emoji. The third trial, fire. Heated metal rods were pressed against their skin. Not randomly, but with precise symbols, burned into flesh. The congregation was told these marks would open the spirit's eye. Underscore. Small blue diamond emoji. The fourth trial, water. One by one, they were submerged into ice-cold basins until their bodies went limp. Only to be revived, coughing and shaking, gasping for air. According to Thomas Hartford, who witnessed it all. This was the point where he could no longer stand. "I vomited. I nearly fainted," he later told investigators. "But I couldn't look away. None of us could." What came next, the final 3 trials, are only partially documented. Hartford's memory was fractured, but recurring reports suggest. The trial of flesh may have involved cutting or scarification. The trial of silence, an extended period of sensory deprivation and isolation. And the trial of light, some form of forced exposure to intense heat and blinding illumination, possibly a symbolic rebirth. Underscore. Throughout each ordeal, the 3 victims screamed in agony. But their cries were met not with horror, but with ritual. The congregation was instructed to chant in unison. Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation. Again and again. Louder. Faster. Until the screams seemed to blend into the rhythm of the chant. Until the victim's pain became part of the worship. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how the congregation reacted. Some wept. Some looked away. But many watched with an eerie stillness. Their faces bathed in candlelight, eyes wide, mouths slightly parted in what Hartford described as reverence, even ecstasy. The first ascension was not merely a ritual. It was a turning point. From that night forward, the Church of the Pure Spirit would no longer hide its darkness behind metaphor. Suffering was no longer the path. It was the gospel. The Ravencroft brothers had spent years indoctrinating their followers, teaching them to associate suffering with spiritual progress. Now, that cruel conditioning bore its monstrous fruit. Just before dawn, after the grueling completion of the 7 trials, 3 victims hung limply from wooden frames, barely conscious, but still alive. Elder Ezra stepped forward and solemnly proclaimed that they had been cleansed of sin and were now vessels ready to be filled with divine spirit. What happened next would scar every witness for life. Prophet Caleb approached each victim in turn, placing his hands gently on their heads and whispering into their ears. According to Thomas Hartford and another witness who later testified to authorities, the reaction was immediate and horrifying. The victims' bodies convulsed with such unnatural violence that the sound of snapping bones echoed through the chamber. Their eyes flew open, wide, bloodshot, and wild, and all 3 began speaking in the same eerie, unknown tongue that Caleb had chanted during prior sermons. By sunrise, all 3 were dead. Elder Ezra declared the ritual a success. The souls of the victims, he claimed, had ascended directly to heaven, cleansed so completely they had bypassed judgment itself. Their corpses, now described as sacred vessels, were not to be buried but preserved. The bodies were laid upon stone slabs in one of the church's newly built underground chambers, where members could visit, pray, and aspire to the same divine fate. Church records later seized by federal authorities confirmed these were only the first. Over the next years, hundreds of corpses would join them in the cold, candlelit catacombs beneath what came to be known as the Church of the Pure Spirit. The morning after that first ascension, several shaken congregants fled Ravenwood without a word. Among them was Thomas Hartford, who would not speak of what he had witnessed for decades, convinced no one would believe such atrocities were possible in Christian America. But for those who stayed, belief deepened. Devotion became fanaticism. The Ravencroft brothers had crossed a line, from brutal ritual into outright murder masked as divine rite, and discovered their power over the flock had only grown stronger. Within the Church of the Pure Spirit, death had become a holy sacrament. According to a former elder who later turned state's witness, Caleb said to his brothers after the ceremony. "We have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now." He was right. The first ascension was only the beginning. What followed was 30 years of unchecked horror, hidden beneath the veneer of righteous faith. Between 1830 and 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit transformed into something far darker than anyone outside its walls could have imagined. The Ravencroft brothers gradually refined their methods and broadened their influence, developing both theological justifications and practical techniques for what they termed elevations in reality, carefully ritualized killings. They were meticulous in maintaining a public image of respectability. Outwardly, their church championed charity, community service, and spiritual renewal, ideals that resonated deeply with a religious revival then sweeping through the burned-over district. To the outside world, the brothers were enthusiastic participants in the broader spiritual community. They hosted gatherings that welcomed other preachers, and they regularly contributed to social causes, including temperance movements and orphanages. But behind this respectable facade, the true nature of their work became increasingly secretive and disturbing. What began as simple underground cellars beneath the church were eventually expanded into an intricate network of tunnels and chambers, well beyond the original footprint of the building. The local laborers who had assisted with the early construction were soon replaced by loyal church members, individuals trusted to keep the church's secrets. Eventually, all excavation was carried out exclusively by the vessels of the Spirit, a select group of followers who had proven unwavering devotion. By 1835, this subterranean complex, known to inner circle members as the catacombs, contained at least 7 major chambers and dozens of smaller alcoves, each with a specific ritual purpose. There was the Chamber of Preparation, where candidates for elevation were isolated for days prior to their ordeal, the Chamber of Trials, where they underwent 7 acts of so-called purification, and the Chamber of Ascension, the site of the final fatal ritual. Most chilling of all was the Chamber of Saints, where the bodies of the ascended were preserved. Unlike traditional faiths, which respectfully bury their dead, the Ravencrofts incorporated corpse preservation into their theology. Some bodies were partially mummified using techniques reportedly learned from medical literature. Others were reduced to clean skeletons, via methods that would later baffle investigators. These remains were arranged in elaborate displays throughout the Chamber of Saints, posed in acts of prayer or spiritual rapture, sometimes even wired to maintain lifelike postures. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832 and escaped in 1844, provided some of the most vivid accounts. "The smell struck you first," she told federal investigators. "Not the stench of rot, as you might expect, but an overwhelming mixture of chemicals, turpentine, alcohol, and something sweet I couldn't place. The brothers called it the perfume of sanctity. I later learned it was embalming fluid." Carver described how new members were slowly indoctrinated. They first heard of the catacombs as symbolic constructs. Later, they were allowed to visit the less disturbing areas. Only those deemed exceptionally loyal were permitted to witness, or participate in, the full rituals. "It was a slow seduction," she explained. "By the time you entered the Chamber of Saints, with its grotesque congregation of the dead, you had been so thoroughly conditioned that you saw beauty, not horror. I remember weeping from what I thought was religious ecstasy the first time I entered. Now, those tears shame me." The frequency of elevations increased steadily. In 1830, church records later seized by authorities documented just 2 ceremonies, resulting in 5 deaths. By 1835, elevations occurred quarterly, with 2 to 4 victims each time. By 1840, they were monthly, with special ceremonies on solstices and equinoxes claiming even more lives. The selection process grew more selective and sinister. At first, the brothers targeted the isolated, orphans, widows, drifters. But as their confidence grew, they began choosing from within the congregation itself, framing the honor of selection as a sacred gift. Offering a child was seen as the highest act of devotion. Parents would compete for this blessing, Carver recalled. They offered their sons and daughters with a fervor I now find incomprehensible. Within the brothers' leadership dynamic, each maintained a distinct role. Elder Ezra was the voice of authority, Deacon Silas the theological scholar, and Prophet Caleb the spiritual visionary. Over time, Caleb's influence overshadowed the others. Former Inner Circle members later described how his visions increasingly dictated church life. By 1840, Caleb alone selected candidates for elevation and determined the nature of each ritual. His mental state, however, appeared to deteriorate. Journal entries attributed to him, discovered hidden in a false compartment of his quarters, reveal a troubling descent into obsession. Amid frantic, fragmented writing were anatomical diagrams and increasingly incoherent reflections. One entry from 1842 reads, "The Spirit has shown me, the soul does not dwell solely in the heart or mind, as is falsely believed, but is dispersed across the body in sacred nodes. Each elevation maps these divine points with greater clarity. Soon, I shall possess the complete anatomy of the soul." By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown to nearly 300 members, presenting the Ravencroft brothers with a grim logistical problem: how to dispose of the evidence left behind by their ever-increasing number of elevations. Their solution was both chilling and ingenious, one of their most macabre innovations to date: selling human remains to medical schools. In the mid-19th century, medical colleges across the United States faced a severe shortage of cadavers for anatomical study. Legal sources were limited, mainly to executed criminals, which proved insufficient for expanding academic needs. This gap gave rise to a black market for bodies, with resurrection men exhuming the newly buried or securing the unclaimed dead from almshouses. Deacon Silas, whose intellectual pursuits had forged connections within academic circles, used these relationships to build a covert network of agents. These agents supplied medical schools in Albany, New York City, and even as far as Philadelphia. Church records from 1840 to 1845 euphemistically state that 67 vessels were donated to the advancement of medical science, a coded reference to the sale of murdered victims' bodies. These transactions served the Ravencrofts on multiple fronts. They erased physical evidence of their crimes, generated substantial income for the church, and granted Deacon Silas access to medical knowledge that would soon darken their rituals further. Through this network, Silas learned advanced preservation techniques and methods of inducing pain without leaving external marks, skills that would elevate the church's brutality to terrifying new heights. By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had evolved far beyond its fringe religious origins. It had become something far more sinister, a self-sustaining engine of indoctrination, ritual murder, and profit, all cloaked in the guise of spiritual enlightenment. A federal investigator would later describe it as a perfect machine for evil, operating in plain sight under the protections of religious liberty. Still, the Ravencrofts could not silence every whisper. As more people joined the church and subsequently vanished from public life, suspicions mounted. Former members who had fled rarely spoke about their time inside, afraid of retaliation or disbelief. But their haunted expressions and refusal to elaborate only fueled speculation among locals. Eventually, these murmurs reached a critical point, sparked by an entirely unrelated investigation. In 1847, James Thornhill, a postal inspector examining financial irregularities in various upstate New York towns, stumbled upon a curious pattern of cash deposits linked to the Church of the Pure Spirit. The amounts were unusually large, more consistent with institutional finances than individual activity, and often accompanied by vague references to research donations sent to medical colleges in Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Thornhill might have dismissed the anomalies as minor fraud had he not encountered Martha Simmons, a former church member who had escaped the community after witnessing her sister's elevation the previous year. At first reluctant, Simmons eventually recounted the horrors she had seen: bodies tortured in underground chambers, children chosen for special blessings who were never seen again, and a nightmarish system masked by faith and piety. Her claims were so grotesque, Thornhill later wrote, that I would have dismissed them as madness, if they hadn't so precisely matched the irregularities I had already uncovered. Thornhill raised his concerns with his superiors, but their response was tepid at best. Religious freedom was fiercely protected, and any accusations against a church required extraordinary evidence. Denied permission to launch an official investigation, Thornhill continued his inquiries privately, building a discreet network of contacts in and around Ravenwood who could report on the Church of the Pure Spirit's activities. One such contact was Dr. William Garrett, a physician in Albany. Garrett had grown suspicious after examining cadavers reportedly donated by the church. Standard practice is to receive bodies from those who had agreed to donate their remains to medical science, he later testified. But these specimens showed signs of antemortem trauma, injuries sustained before death that had partially healed. And their manner of death was eerily consistent, signs of asphyxiation combined with extreme physical stress. In 1850, Garrett quietly reached out to Thornhill and provided detailed medical reports on 7 such bodies. These documents offered the first scientific evidence that something deeply disturbing was occurring within the Church of the Pure Spirit. Still, the authorities hesitated. Without undeniable proof of criminal activity, they remained reluctant to act against a religious institution. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1851, from an entirely unexpected source. Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, whose mental state had been deteriorating for years, reached a breaking point, according to later testimony from church members. He began experiencing violent episodes, claiming spirits were emerging from the walls and that the divine anatomy had become visible in the air. His prophetic sermons grew increasingly erratic and terrifying, even for his most loyal followers. To contain the crisis, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas restricted Caleb's public appearances, claiming he was undergoing deep communion with the Spirit. Privately, however, they confined him to a specially constructed room in the farthest reaches of the underground chambers, where his screams wouldn't be heard from above. This fragile control shattered on the night of June 17, 1851. Caleb escaped his restraints, navigated the labyrinthine catacombs, and emerged from the woods onto the edge of church grounds. What happened next shocked the entire region. According to the Albany Evening Journal, Prophet Caleb appeared naked and covered in self-inflicted wounds during a community gathering in Ravenwood's town square, held to celebrate the summer planting. Before a stunned crowd, he declared himself the living vessel of the pure spirit and described in disturbing detail the rituals conducted beneath the church. "The blood of the purified strengthens our connection to the divine," he reportedly shouted. 27 vessels have been emptied, and the Spirit has filled me with their essence. The chambers beneath hold the sacred remains of the elevated, and soon, all of you shall join them in glorious suffering. Initially dismissed as a deranged man, Caleb's identity as one of the Ravencroft brothers changed everything. Thornhill, who had maintained connections with local officials, was informed immediately. He arrived in Ravenwood the next day to personally interview Caleb. What he encountered was a man on the brink of total psychological collapse, vacillating between catatonic silence and manic confession. In his lucid moments, Prophet Caleb described the church's hidden rituals in chilling detail, corroborating previous testimonies from escaped members. Most crucially, he sketched maps of the underground chambers, identifying hidden entrances and the so-called Chamber of Saints, where victims' remains were stored. With this new evidence, including first-hand testimony from Caleb himself, Thornhill finally secured authorization for an official investigation. However, word of Caleb's detention and questioning quickly reached Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas. What followed demonstrated their ruthless capacity for crisis management. Within hours, they initiated a secret protocol later revealed in church records as the Cleansing Flame. Inner Circle members were dispatched to remove incriminating materials from the underground chambers, financial documents and the most recently deceased bodies. Then, in a bold and calculated move, they set a controlled fire in the main church building. The fire was deliberately designed to destroy key areas while leaving others intact, creating the illusion of an unfortunate accident rather than a cover-up. By the time authorities arrived with a search warrant on June 19, 1851, They found a partially burned structure and a congregation already engaged in cleanup efforts. Elder Ezra met them with outward cooperation, expressing sorrow over his brother's condition and apparent surprise at the fire. "It seems God has tested us doubly," he told investigators. "First with my beloved brother's affliction, and now with this terrible blaze. But we shall rebuild. Faith must always rise from the ashes." The investigation that followed was hindered not only by the extensive fire damage but also by the brothers' calculated planning. The main entrance to the tunnel system had collapsed during the blaze, delaying access for weeks. When excavation crews finally uncovered the underground chambers, they found many of them partially flooded, caused by a deliberate diversion of a nearby stream. Much of the interior had been hastily emptied, with clear signs of an organized effort to destroy or remove incriminating evidence. Despite these efforts, enough remained to validate the most disturbing elements of Prophet Caleb's confession. In chambers untouched by the flames or flood, investigators uncovered custom-made restraints, instruments modified for torture, and a range of chemical substances typically used in embalming. Most damning was the so-called Chamber of Saints. Despite attempts to erase the horrors within, dozens of human remains were discovered, some skeletal, others grotesquely preserved. "The scene defies adequate description," wrote federal investigator Daniel Blackwood in his official report. "Skeletal figures posed in prayer, partially embalmed corpses seated as if attending a congregation, and worst of all, small side rooms filled with the remains of children. They appeared to be at play, but bore unmistakable signs of violent deaths." Even though newspapers were heavily censored due to Victorian-era sensitivities, enough detail seeped through to shock the public. The Albany Evening Journal ran the June 25, 1851 headline, "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House, Brothers Accused of Unspeakable Acts in the Name of Faith." As authorities worked to identify the victims and fully comprehend the scope of the Ravencroft brothers' crimes, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas continued to profess innocence. They insisted Prophet Caleb had acted alone, concealing his actions from the rest of the church leadership. Given the brothers' strict division of responsibilities within the church, this defense might have swayed some, if not for one final, devastating piece of evidence. Hidden beneath Deacon Silas's private quarters, investigators uncovered a leather-bound ledger spanning from 1829 to 1851. Written in his own hand, the book meticulously documented each so-called elevation, listing names, dates, methods of death, and the fate of the bodies, some of which had been sold to medical institutions. Crucially, the entries referenced direct involvement by all three brothers, with Elder Ezra singled out as the one who selected candidates for elevation. This ledger, combined with testimony from former followers and Prophet Caleb's confession, provided overwhelming proof of the brothers' guilt. On July 3, 1851, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft were arrested on charges of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. The case quickly became one of the most sensational trials of the 19th century. Authorities kept the most graphic evidence sealed, fearing its impact on public morality and religious sentiment. Yet the investigation widened, revealing atrocities that extended far beyond the walls of the church. The Ravencrofts' crimes were not isolated acts, but the workings of a sprawling, deeply embedded network. As summer wore on, investigators uncovered a chilling truth: the Church of the Pure Spirit was not just a fringe cult, it was a front for a complex criminal enterprise with reach into religious, medical, and financial institutions. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas remained in custody, while Prophet Caleb, declared mentally unfit for trial, was confined to the Utica State Lunatic Asylum. Their followers, shaken and disillusioned, scattered. Some fled prosecution, others stayed in Ravenwood, stunned by the collapse of everything they had believed. To coordinate the expanding investigation, Daniel Blackwood established a temporary field office in Ravenwood. As he combed through records, testimony, and physical evidence, a far more sinister timeline emerged. The Ravencrofts did not begin in Ravenwood, he wrote in a confidential report to Washington. Evidence indicates similar patterns as far back as 1817. In at least 3 earlier locations, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, the brothers had established religious communities, recruited vulnerable followers, and vanished just as suspicions arose. What made Ravenwood different was the scale, and the years-long duration, of their operation. Documents found in a hidden vault beneath Silas's quarters confirm that the brothers had operated under various aliases, refining their tactics with each relocation and slowly developing the doctrine that would become the Church of the Pure Spirit. Even more disturbing was evidence that they had not acted alone. Letters exchanged between Deacon Silas and faculty at several medical colleges hinted at a tacit awareness, if not outright complicity, regarding the source of the specimens. One particularly chilling letter, dated 1844, came from a well-known Philadelphia anatomist. It praised the exceptional preparation of the bodies and noted, "The subjects show evidence of anatomical study prior to death, as though they were made ready for dissection while still alive." This discovery opened a new and horrifying dimension to the case, one that suggested not just religious fanaticism, but calculated exploitation of human life in service of medicine, money, and power. The Ravencrofts had not simply been sacrificing their followers in the name of religious purification, they had been carrying out systematic, calculated experiments on living subjects. Every act of violence was documented, every body preserved or sold, and every discovery quietly handed over to medical institutions eager for anatomical research. According to expert testimony from Dr. Samuel Prescott of Albany Medical College, the patterns of injury, the preservation techniques, and the meticulous anatomical notes suggest a deliberate attempt to study human responses to various stimuli, especially pain and its impact on bodily systems. It was primitive physiological research, but research nonetheless. Then, in August 1851, the investigation took a dramatic and unexpected turn. A respected Boston physician, Dr. Jonathan Crane, came forward with information that changed everything. Dr. Crane had attended Harvard Medical School in the 1820s, where he recalled a visiting lecturer named Simon Ravencroft, an unsettling figure who spoke of pain as a spiritual and scientific key. "I remember being disturbed by his methods and conclusions," Dr. Crane testified. He described experiments that even then felt unethical, and spoke of pain as a gateway to religious ecstasy. "I dismissed him as a dangerous eccentric, until I saw the Ravencroft case in the papers. The sketches. The theories. It was him. Simon Ravencroft is Silas Ravencroft." This revelation reshaped the entire case. The so-called religion of the Church of the Pure Spirit had not been a justification for violence, it had been carefully engineered to enable it. Their doctrine wasn't just about control, it was a theological mask for a decades-long experiment in human suffering. The brothers had crafted a belief system that not only allowed such cruelty, but sanctified it. As the investigation deepened, agents uncovered a concealed chamber beneath Deacon Silas's quarters. Inside, they found hundreds of notebooks filled with anatomical drawings, experimental methods, and detailed notes. Over time, the entries shifted. Early journals were laced with religious language, but later volumes read like cold scientific treatises. One chilling entry from 1848 read, "Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of, redacted. Heart continued functioning for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials. Blood loss estimated at 1.7 liters. Results support hypothesis regarding sustainability of vital functions under extreme conditions." When presented with this evidence during interrogation, Elder Ezra's religious fervor crumbled. According to transcripts, he laughed, long and loud, before calmly stating, "You understand nothing. The Spirit has many names. Some call it God, others, science. We sought knowledge that others were too weak to pursue. Our followers were elevated. Their suffering had meaning. Their deaths had purpose." The truth sent shockwaves through the medical community. Prominent universities and hospitals that had received research or remains from the Ravencrofts now faced uncomfortable scrutiny. The scandal ignited national debate over the ethics of medical research and the blurred line between scientific curiosity and moral depravity. Meanwhile, Excavation of the church grounds continued. Investigators initially worked from Prophet Caleb's claim of 217 vessels, but the actual number quickly surpassed that. By September, Chief Investigator Blackwood reported, "We've identified the remains of at least 276 individuals. Soil analysis and evidence of tunnel expansion suggest there are more, possibly beneath neighboring properties." Worse still, newly uncovered letters revealed the brothers had not only preyed on devoted followers but had actively lured outsiders. Correspondence between Elder Ezra and contacts in nearby towns detailed a system for identifying vulnerable individuals, immigrants, travelers, and the poor. One letter read, "The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel. No family, seeking work, strong constitution. I have sent him to Ravenwood with promise of mill employment. Expect his arrival by Saturday." This evidence reframed the case yet again. It was no longer just religious extremism, it was organized abduction and murder, fueled by profit and a twisted pursuit of knowledge. The brothers' crimes hinted at a broader, more chilling network of complicity. Just when it seemed the horrors of Ravenwood had been fully unearthed, the truth proved even darker than anyone imagined. The breakthrough that finally exposed the true scale of the Ravencroft operation came in October 1851, when investigators located Samuel Parsons, the church's former accountant. Parsons had served the Church of the Pure Spirit from 1835 until 1849, when he was quietly replaced by a new member living under an assumed identity in western Massachusetts. Parsons had fled the church after uncovering the real purpose behind certain financial transactions. "I believed I was managing donations and legitimate business interests," he later testified under immunity. But everything changed when he noticed budget entries for specimen preparation and research grants that suspiciously aligned with the disappearances of several congregation members. Realizing the horrifying implications, Parsons began secretly keeping his own ledger. When Elder Ezra discovered the private records, Parsons was slated for special prayer counseling, a term he had come to understand meant selection for elevation. He escaped that night with nothing but the clothes on his back. Despite having left his records behind, Parsons provided investigators with an astonishingly detailed account from memory. He named medical institutions that had paid for bodies and research, wealthy patrons who unknowingly funded the brothers' grotesque experiments under the guise of scientific work, and church members who had assisted in various roles. Most significantly, he revealed the existence of a second facility, a remote farmhouse located nearly 40 miles from Ravenwood. Purchased through a middleman in 1840, this hidden site had been kept secret even from the church's inner circle. Ezra called it the garden, Parsons recalled. Only he, Deacon Silas, and 2 trusted assistants ever went there. Supplies were delivered monthly, medical tools, chemicals, restraints, and occasionally, selected subjects. Always at night. None ever returned. _ The garden. When authorities finally located and searched the farmhouse, what they found dwarfed even the horrors beneath the church. The property had been converted into a sophisticated research facility, with separate rooms for different categories of experimentation. Records revealed the site was primarily used for long-term studies, subjects kept alive for weeks or even months while undergoing procedures that were meticulously documented. The most appalling revelation was the facility's focus on children. A detached building on the property contained tiny cells and equipment built specifically for juvenile subjects. Ledgers and notes indicated that at least 37 children, aged between 4 and 16, had been held at the facility between 1840 and 1851. This discovery ignited national outrage. Previously restrained newspapers now published harrowing details. The New York Tribune ran the headline, "Monsters in Human Form, Ravencroft Brothers' Crimes Against Innocents Revealed." Public protests erupted. Demonstrators demanded justice. Political pressure mounted for a trial that would not only punish the guilty but also reaffirm the limits of religious freedom and scientific ethics. Inside the prison, both brothers began to unravel. Elder Ezra reportedly spoke to invisible presences in his cell, while Deacon Silas attempted suicide after viewing photographs and documents from the garden. _ The trial begins, January 1852. By the end of 1851, what began as a local investigation had become a national scandal. On January 12, 1852, the trial of Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft commenced in Albany, New York. The trial attracted thousands, some traveling from Boston and Philadelphia. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the unholy brothers. Security was unprecedented. Over 6 weeks, the prosecution methodically built its case. More than 100 witnesses testified, including former church members who described their indoctrination into purification rituals. Medical experts confirmed widespread evidence of torture and systematic experimentation. Financial analysts demonstrated the brothers' personal profit from selling bodies and scientific data. The most heartbreaking testimonies came from the victims' families. Sarah Wilkinson, mother of 16-year-old Emma who had joined the church in 1847, described how her daughter's letters grew stranger until they stopped altogether. The final note said she was being elevated and that Wilkinson should rejoice. When I traveled to Ravenwood, Elder Ezra told me she had been sent to their retreat for spiritual preparation and could not receive visitors. 3 weeks later, he said she had ascended to the pure spirit. I was never shown her body. He claimed it had been sanctified and could not leave church grounds. Defense and dissent. The brothers responded differently during the proceedings. Deacon Silas remained withdrawn, barely speaking except to his attorneys. Elder Ezra, in contrast, seemed disturbingly calm, often smiling during the most damning testimonies, even nodding in apparent approval. When the defense finally spoke, their strategy became clear. They would not deny the deaths, or even many of the practices described. Instead, they argued that the activities of the Church of the Pure Spirit were protected under the First Amendment. The Constitution guarantees freedom of religious practice, said defense attorney William Hargrove. These rituals, while extreme to outsiders, were conducted with the consent of the participants who shared the Ravencroft's belief in spiritual purification through suffering. Unanswered questions. As the trial unfolded, lead investigator Blackwood remained deeply uneasy. The brothers' operation had been too large, too well-funded, and too long-running to have gone unnoticed. Their ties to academic and medical institutions, and the presence of wealthy benefactors, hinted at a larger conspiracy. In his private journal dated December 1851, Blackwood wrote, "I am increasingly convinced that we have uncovered merely the visible portion of something far more extensive. The Ravencrofts are undoubtedly guilty of unspeakable crimes, but I suspect they were merely agents of a greater enterprise, one that may still be operating in the shadows. Justice may be done in this trial, but I fear the full truth may never come to light." His words would prove prophetic, more than anyone imagined, as the trial of the century moved toward its conclusion. To illuminate the path. The message was written in Elder Ezra's unmistakable hand. Dr. Mitchell's death reignited public hysteria and confirmed for many that Ezra Ravencroft had not only survived but was continuing his so-called ministrations beyond the walls of any institution, unchecked and perhaps even more dangerous than before. The murder marked the beginning of a series of grim incidents throughout the summer of 1852, livestock found drained of blood with strange sigils burned into nearby soil, disappearances of individuals who had testified at the trial, and anonymous packages containing human teeth or tufts of scorched hair delivered to reporters who had covered the proceedings most aggressively. Despite the mounting terror, federal and state authorities failed to make any progress. The manhunt dwindled to scattered efforts as other crises took priority, and the public, already numbed by the horror of the trial, began to grow quiet, avoiding mention of the Ravencroft name altogether. A quiet but enduring fear took root, a superstition whispered in back rooms and rural churches, that to speak of Elder Ezra was to invite his gaze. By autumn, A crude pamphlet began circulating among French spiritualist communities, titled The Ascendant Mind, Notes on the Transcendent Biology of Death, bearing no author but widely believed to have been written by Ezra himself. It was filled with diagrams of human anatomy overlaid with mystic symbols, descriptions of pain as the vital frequency, and theories merging metaphysical speculation with esoteric neuroscience. Several copies were confiscated by police, others vanished into private collections. Scholars who examined the text called it profoundly unsettling and intellectually seductive in the most dangerous way. Judge Blackwood, now retired, was quoted in a letter dated December 1852. "If Ezra lives, then so does the doctrine he created. He has stepped into the shadows not as a fugitive, but as a prophet unbound by laws or shame. What remains to us is not justice, but the long watch against his return." Whether Elder Ezra truly survived the fire or died in obscurity remains one of the darkest enigmas in 19th-century American history. But for years to come, children in upstate New York would be warned not to stray too far into the woods or speak with strangers offering sermons in quiet tones. And always, always, they were told to avoid the name Ravencroft. Because monsters, after all, are rarely slain. Sometimes, they simply vanish. The spirit sees all who betray its work. These chilling words were left at the scene of a brutal murder, one of 3 physicians killed over the course of a year, each linked to the investigation into the Ravencroft brothers. The killings bore the same ritualistic hallmarks, identical postures, nearly identical notes, and an unmistakable message: someone was systematically silencing those who had helped expose the Church of the Pure Spirit. Fear gripped the community of investigators, witnesses, and anyone who had touched the case. By 1854, the investigation had largely been abandoned. Elder Ezra was presumed to have fled the country, his whereabouts unknown. Scattered reports began to surface in places like New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco, accounts of small, secretive religious groups practicing rites disturbingly similar to those of the Church. None led to Ezra's capture. Agent Blackwood, though officially reassigned, remained haunted by the case. His private inquiries convinced him that Elder Ezra had not merely escaped, but had re-established his operation, possibly aided by a far-reaching network of devoted followers. In his final report before retiring in 1860, he wrote, "The Ravencroft case does not represent the end of a criminal enterprise, but merely its revelation. The blend of religious zealotry, unrestrained scientific curiosity, and the seductive promise of higher knowledge forms a powerfully persistent danger. I fear we have only driven this darkness deeper into the shadows, where it continues its work unseen." His warning would prove prophetic. In the years that followed, sporadic reports described religious groups bearing a disturbing resemblance to the Church of the Pure Spirit. These organizations would appear briefly, often disappearing after strange occurrences or local disappearances, leaving behind only rumors and fear. None could be definitively linked to Elder Ezra, but the pattern suggested his ideology, if not his presence, endured. The most significant incident came in 1862, a full decade after the original case. A secluded chapel calling itself the Sanctuary of Divine Understanding was discovered abandoned near the Massachusetts-Vermont border. Authorities investigating reports of strange lights and sounds uncovered a hidden cellar beneath the structure. Inside were signs of recent ritual activity closely matching practices from the Ravencroft case. Most disturbing was a journal recovered from the scene. Handwriting experts later confirmed the author's script matched that of Elder Ezra. The final entry, dated just 3 days before the discovery, read, "The work continues, as it must. Each vessel brings clarity. Each elevation brings us closer to revelation. In 100 years, when the full truth is known, all will see our sacrifice as the foundation of a new era. The Spirit is patient. Its servants must be also." Whether this was Ezra's final word, or simply another disappearance before resurfacing, remains a mystery. After the 1853 Albany jail fire, no verified sightings of him were ever reported, and his ultimate fate remains one of the great unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The official investigation was closed in 1862 following the discovery of the abandoned sanctuary and Ezra's presumed final writings. With the Civil War demanding federal attention, authorities declared the case resolved. The physical evidence from Ravenwood and related sites, journals, ritual tools, financial documents, anatomical sketches, was placed in a special archive within the Department of Justice, accessible only to those with high-level clearance. For decades, this collection sat largely untouched, a silent testament to the government's discomfort with confronting the full scope of the brothers' crimes. The town of Ravenwood never recovered. The church grounds were seized and demolished. The land remains vacant. Many residents relocated, unwilling to live in the shadow of what newspapers had dubbed the American House of Horrors. Some who had lost loved ones in the so-called elevations formed a support network, first called the Assembly of Reconciliation, and later simply the Assembly. Over time, it expanded to support victims of similar cultic abuses elsewhere. The Assembly committed itself to identifying and opposing religious practices that exploit the vulnerable under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. Perhaps the most lasting consequence of the Ravencroft case came not in law enforcement but in the field of medical ethics. The revelation that respected institutions had accepted, and at times, sought out, anatomical material sourced through horrific means triggered national outcry. In 1855, the American Medical Association established its first formal code of ethics regarding cadaver use, mandating documented, legal acquisition for all specimens used in medical education or research. In 1858, several states followed with laws imposing stricter oversight on medical schools and anatomical research. Dr. William Harrison, a key figure in exposing the Ravencroft's ties to the medical community, became a national voice for reform. His 1860 treatise, The Moral Imperative in Scientific Inquiry, warned, "Knowledge obtained through cruelty is corrupted at its source. Science without conscience becomes a tool of atrocity, veiled as progress." The Ravencroft's dangerous fusion of fringe religious beliefs and pseudo-scientific experimentation exposed vulnerabilities at the intersection of faith, science, and authority, vulnerabilities that America would continue to wrestle with long after the details of their crimes faded from headlines. Throughout the late 19th century, rumors of Elder Ezra's survival persisted. Alleged sightings placed him in remote mining camps, secretive New Orleans spiritual societies, even European medical conferences. None were confirmed, yet the legend endured, proof of how deeply his uniquely charismatic malevolence had embedded itself in the national psyche. More tangible was the legacy left by his followers. Between 1865 and 1890, at least 7 small religious sects across the U.S. were found to incorporate elements of the Church of the Pure Spirit's teachings and rituals. While none matched the original group's size or extremity, their existence hinted at an unsettling truth: the ideas seeded by the Ravencroft brothers had taken root, and were growing, beyond their control. The Ravencroft legacy, a tale of faith, science, and horror. One of the most significant offshoots of the Ravencroft movement was uncovered in 1879 in rural Missouri. There, a charismatic preacher known as Brother Elijah had founded a secluded community centered on the belief that transcendence could be achieved through suffering. When local authorities began investigating unsettling reports from the area, they discovered ritual artifacts and journals directly referencing the teachings of Ravencroft. Brother Elijah was later identified as Thomas Whitfield, a former high-ranking member of the Church of the Pure Spirit. Rather than face arrest, he took his own life. The final confirmed chapter of the Ravencroft saga surfaced 2 decades later. In 1899, an anonymous donor submitted a locked iron box to the Harvard Medical School library. Its contents included decades of journals, anatomical sketches, and experimental notes dating from 1852 to 1898. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the most recent entries were penned by Elder Ezra himself, now showing signs of extreme age. The last entry, dated December 31, 1898, read: "As the century draws to its close, so too does my work in this vessel. H has finally accomplished what the law could not. I go now to join the pure spirit, contenting knowing that the seeds we planted have taken root and will flower in ways we could only imagine. The next generation of seekers will build upon our foundation, finding new methods for the great work of transcendence. The suffering was necessary. The knowledge remains. The spirit continues. Whether this was truly Elder Ezra's farewell or an elaborate fabrication remains unknown. If genuine, it would suggest he lived to 115, an extraordinary, though not impossible, lifespan. Yet beyond questions of authorship, the journals contain something more disturbing, detailed experimental procedures and medical observations that, shockingly, appear to have influenced early 20th century scientific research. Upon discovering the nature of the materials, Harvard officials restricted access. In 1902, after discussions with federal authorities, the collection was moved to a secure government archive. It remained classified until 1972, when select scholars studying medical ethics were granted limited access. The original site of the Church of the Pure Spirit, located in Ravenwood, New York, stood untouched until 1923. That year, the state declared it a restricted zone, fencing off the property and posting warnings against trespassing. Locals spoke of strange lights, eerie sounds, and overwhelming dread experienced near the perimeter. In 1967, a research team from the State University of New York conducted the first archaeological survey of the area using modern techniques. What they found stunned even the most skeptical: additional human remains buried in parts of the tunnel system never previously explored. The updated death toll rose to over 400, far exceeding the 276 officially recorded. More chilling was the discovery of a sealed chamber. Inside were preserved documents outlining plans for expansion beyond Ravenwood, indicating the church had been envisioned as the first of many hubs for a national, possibly international, network. This vision may have continued under Elder Ezra's leadership after his escape. Over 160 years since the Ravencroft's dark reign was uncovered, their influence lingers. In religious studies, they are a cautionary tale of how charismatic leadership, gradual normalization of deviant behavior, and the human thirst for spiritual meaning can justify atrocities. In medical ethics, their experiments remain a grim reminder of why moral boundaries must never be breached in the name of science. And in criminal psychology, the Ravencrofts stand as early examples of systematized killers hiding behind respected institutions. For families affected by their crimes, however, the story is not academic. It's a wound in American history that has never fully healed. To this day, descendants of victims and survivors gather each year in Albany at a memorial erected in 1902. Its inscription is simple: "For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten." The questions that plagued investigator Blackwood in 1852 still echo. How did the Ravencroft brothers devise such a fusion of spiritual control and pseudo-scientific horror? Who else knew, or helped? And most haunting of all, how much of their influence persists today, hidden within modern institutions? The true horror of the Ravencroft legacy is not just the cruelty of their acts, but the terrifying realization that their story is not an anomaly, but a warning. When charisma, authority, and ideology override our deepest moral codes, even the most civilized societies can become breeding grounds for evil. In the dense forests of upstate New York, where the church once stood, the land remains eerily untouched. The soil still bears the scars of foundations that time refuses to erase. Locals claim that, even now, on still nights, an unnatural silence blankets the area, as if something beneath the ground is still listening, still waiting, still hungry.